Welcome to another episode of the British Society of Criminology's Hate Crime Network podcast with your hosts, Dr Rachel Keighley and Dr Irene Zempi. Today's guest is Dr Monish Bhatia, who won our Article Paper Prize in 2021 for their paper, The Permission to be Cruel, Street-Level Bureaucrats and Harms Against People Seeking Asylum. So, Monish, as you point out in the paper, immigration and asylum policies and practices in Britain have turned increasingly hostile. Can you explain how the state inflicts harm on people seeking asylum through its policies and practices? And perhaps in your response, maybe can you reflect on the underlying attitudes and motivations that produce these exclusionary and hostile immigration and asylum policies?
Thank you. This is such an enormous question and a very important one because the policies and practices are not introduced with an intention to provide care and support, but they are there to marginalize, exclude, and segregate, and are guided by enforcement and control logics. Actually, I will go as far to say that the British state strategically introduces policies and practices so as to inflict cruelty, and this cruelty and abandonment is the modus operandi of the state. So these individuals are fleeing wars, violence, and persecution, life-threatening situations, and they are subjected to a level of suffering that should make the entire country raging with anger. For instance, look at the Manston detention facility in Kent, chronically overcrowded, unsanitary, cold, nasty, and inhumane conditions that have breached the most basic of health and safety provisions. There was a MSRA, diphtheria, and scabies outbreak in the center. So imagine arriving in a country seeking sanctuary, safety, and protection, and subjected to this level of neglect and denial of care and humanity. So this cruelty was not a mishap or unintentional or unfortunate outcome of otherwise benign policies. The neglect and denial of care and harm was intentional, and it was carefully implanted. So a 31-year-old man and father called Hussein Hasib Ahmed died and was tested positive for diphtheria. Of course, the death is subject of coronial investigation and prisons and probation ombudsman investigation. But regardless of the outcome, we know that he died in these filthy and cruel conditions and was treated along with others as if his and their lives did not matter. So no one can change that fact. The Manston Center closed its doors at the end of November 2022, but the trauma that people endured cannot be reversed or forgotten, and this trauma will certainly not end for them as they're still subject to hostile policies and practices. So as I mentioned, your question is quite enormous, so I'm going to zoom in further into this. So look, it is very clear that over the past 3 decades or more, immigration and asylum policies and practices have been subjected to racialization and criminalization. There's this very shoddy state tabloid and right-wing press narrative around so-called illegals and bogus asylum seekers, boat people, queue jumpers, and more recently, in the words of Suella Braverman, invasion of migrants that has consumed the discussions and debates on asylum. There is a constant creation and activation of us versus them, and them being fundamentally different from us, which makes them a problem. And this problem needs to be managed and controlled and even pushed back or denied rescue in the channel. So for instance, there was an investigation into the drowning in the channel. 27 people drowned and 5 are missing but feared death. So as part of this investigation, French authorities disclosed the call logs of distress calls made by people on board. On reading the transcripts, it was clear that neither French or English authorities wanted to help the migrants, and they were rather consumed by the exact geolocation of the boat and whether they were in French or English waters. So they were dumping responsibility on each other and using location to justify their lack of actions or inactions. People on board were constantly given false assurances for over 2 hours. So bear in mind, right, these are distress calls and people are at risk of drowning. They feared death and their lives were left hanging. And they did let her drown as authorities played football with their lives. You know what is even more disturbing? Is the fact that UK Coast Guards are now to receive legal training to give evidence and defend their actions in future inquests or inquiries. So this entire episode and official actions or inactions are appalling, callous, and outright hostile. Sure they are, but this is also how violence is inflicted. It is invisibilized and subsequently denied. 32 lives lost, 32. The entire discourse, right, of bogus, fraudulent threat has had, and it continues to have a gigantic impact on the treatment individuals receive. It has also led to humanitarian ideals being rapidly replaced by official approaches solely designed to manage and control the so-called undesirable and undeserving migrants. So borders and bordering are not only found around the country's frontiers, they are also actively created and enforced internally. So when it comes to borders inside the country, people seeking asylum are subjected to a multitude of disciplinary and regulatory technologies, and they are restricted and immobilized. The British state has built a very dense web of controls that have only intensified since the implementation of the hostile environment agenda. So by this, I mean that the state has invited or they have drawn in different actors and institutions which were not previously connected with immigration enforcement, but now they're now they're being drawn into the immigration control arena, such as the police, private security contractors, those working in health and social services, and even members of the public who can call the immigration hotline and report on migrants. I want to read out a quote, and this is from one of my participants called Wasi, which is a pseudonym. And the interview with him was done in Urdu, and I've translated it into English. So Wasi mentions, living as an asylum seeker is like living in a multi-chambered cage. On certain days, I'm shown an open door and I try to escape, try to fly, only to find that door has led me to another chamber of the cage. I try again and end up in a different chamber. Flying and escaping is always an illusion. The cage is real. I'm living in it. It is everywhere. Seeking asylum is seeking a life in cage. The British government is killing me. I just want to fly. So the controls are dispersed in different directions. And these widening nets of control are not only debilitating, but they also create a feeling of ever-present captivity and not able to see or even visualize a secure and stable future. So people are pushed in limbo where they are left in painful and grueling waiting and suffer unmediated harms. So can I just check, in your question, you asked me about how state inflicts harms through policies and practices. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Yeah. Thank you. Okay, I will explain further about the policies and practices then. So when people apply for asylum, some of them are given accommodation on a no-choice basis and dispersed in various and remote parts of the country. The accommodation that is provided to them is provided by private profit-making contractors. So people seeking asylum cannot claim benefits. There's this entire political and tabloid discourse around welfare scroungers and people coming for benefits. But in reality, and something that I have repeatedly noted during the fieldwork, these individuals know absolutely nothing about welfare benefits before they arrive. And they have absolutely no expectation that they would receive any form of financial support. They have no clue about what they or their children are entitled to, which is not a lot anyway. Majority of individuals live below the poverty line and experience poor health. They cannot even afford even the basics. So state gives them around, I think it gives them around £40 per week, which is loaded onto the prepaid card that you can spend only in certain supermarkets. So this equates to roughly around £5.70 a day and does not include travel. And you can only buy selected things. People are not allowed to work or earn living, and the state has excluded them from the labor market. And once again, people are forced to live in dire conditions and below the poverty line. On top of this, they are subject to a whole host of control measures. For instance, people have to go for signing at the immigration reporting centers. The reporting happens weekly or fortnightly, or any frequency as established by the immigration authorities. So a lot of individuals I know cannot afford travel to these centers, as the £5.70 per day does not include travel. So some walk for miles and miles in rain and cold to simply comply with reporting restrictions. Individuals can be taken into detention centers from these reporting events. So they go to report and suddenly the authorities will decide, okay, we're going to detain them. And from reporting centers, they can be detained without any warning. It is unannounced. So individuals are aware of that they can be detained from reporting centers. And this causes a great deal of anxiety. So I know people who have suffered from panic attacks on days leading to reporting, and especially on the day of reporting. And you must be aware, individuals are now, on top of reporting, are also subjected to electronic monitoring and round-the-clock intrusive surveillance, and they're fitted with an ankle monitor, GPS ankle monitor. So this is 24/7 surveillance. Actually, in one of my previous articles, I have explained the issues and impacts of electronic monitoring on migrants. And more recently, Bill for Immigration Detainees, Medical Justice, and the Public Law Project have published a report outlining a whole range of issues with GPS monitoring. And also Privacy International has submitted a report to the Information Commissioner highlighting issues with GPS monitoring. So with regards to harm, look, it is very well evident in the psychiatric literature that those seeking asylum suffer from higher rates of mental or psychological distress. This includes acute stress, anxiety, depression. A lot of it is due to pre-migratory conditions and exposure to traumatic events in the country of origin, like war, torture, fleeing, witnessing death, separation from family and community, but also something that the trauma they endure during the migratory journey. The level of hostility individuals face in Britain has serious consequences for their health. The hostility they experience in this country is not a one-off event. So it's not something that just happens and then everything is calm. It's not a one-off event, but it's rather something they're exposed to every single day of their lives. So it is cumulative. What they endure in Britain amounts to psychological torture And we really need to reorient the way we think and see and talk about their treatment, because what they are experiencing is psychological torture. The British state is actively inflicting psychological torture. The delays in the asylum case decision-making, difficult bureaucratic processes, material deprivation, living below the poverty line, non-stop surveillance, and lasting fear of detention and deportation, all of this is horrendous. Britain keeps projecting itself as beacon of human rights and refugee protection. I seriously beg to differ. Asylum-seeking individuals are racially devalued, and they're rendered literally as socially dead, and they're deliberately pushed into these painful conditions. So what they are suffering, the harm that they are suffering, is actually calculated and sanctioned by the state. And they need to be considered as a form of, or need to be considered as state racism and violence. Yeah.
Thank you. This is a great insight, isn't it, into the impacts with regards to the state's hostile approach to immigration and asylum seeking in terms of policies. So moving forward, the quotes throughout the paper are very impactful, particularly about individuals' mental distress, self-harm, substance misuse, racist victimization, and suicides. Can you please tell us a bit more about the psychological impacts of these policies and practices for people seeking asylum? And also, in your response, could you please also reflect on the street level bureaucrats and the ways in which they actually enact state power?
Thank you. Once again, a very important question. I will explain this in points so that it is easier for the listeners to understand. First, I will start with asylum housing and associated issues. So as I mentioned earlier, asylum housing is now privatized, and profit-making security companies are managing asylum housing. They are contracted to manage asylum housing. To date, there have been numerous scandals and inquiries exposing these substandard housing provisions. But these inquiries lead to nowhere, and private contractors are never subjected to criminal sanctions for failing to meet their contractual obligation, which is to provide safe and secure housing. So in my study, I repeatedly observed that housing contractors or the Home Office, they rarely conducted assessment of whether this individual is suitable to be placed in a property, right? So there was no risk assessment as far as I'm aware of. In some cases, people who were already suffering from mental distress, addiction issues, or exhibiting suicidal or self-harming behavior, they all were placed together with otherwise healthy individuals who had like mild to moderate PTSD symptoms. Of course, the conditions in the property were horrendous. Insects and rodent infestation, damp and mold, insufficient heating and insulation, blocked drains, the smell, you name it, okay? Some individuals then ended up adopting ways to distort the reality by consuming drugs and alcohol. As one of the participants mentioned, and I will read out the query. The carpet on the floor is so wet, no heating, no hot water, and no place to cook. When you called me to arrange for an interview, I was under blankets, you know. If you are in that place, you have to wear 4 to 5 clothes and have loads of blankets to keep you warm. Every night there's a fight. It is so much noise, I can't handle it. Since the time I've started taking drugs, I feel my pain is reduced. I never did this before coming into this country, never had alcohol or smoke. So there were other cases as well where elderly asylum claimants, people with severe mobility issues, women in latter stages of their pregnancies, women with children all of them were placed in such unhygienic, filthy properties that lack the most basic of the basic health and safety and access provisions, right? Some suffered from accidents and injuries, some experienced, tummy infections, and all of them went through deterioration of physical and mental health conditions while being placed in these filthy home office private contracted properties. The second point is around the dispersal policy. So dispersal policy was implemented under the Immigration and Asylum Act 1999. And the dispersal policy basically means sending asylum seekers to various parts of the country. So in my study, I found a very strong link between the dispersal policy and racist violence directed against the individuals. So there's already an academic research that strongly suggests that tabloid and right-wing press campaigns against asylum seekers have generated a hostility and a serious discontent in certain areas. And dispersal has partly created a sort of a narrative that you have to blame asylum seekers for poverty and lack of resources, blame them for the lack of housing, blame them for insufficient benefits, because this is how divisive politics is played out, right? A large number of dispersal areas are also predominantly white. They are seriously under-resourced. So people who are already living in that area are disadvantaged right from the outset. Also, they have very little previous history of accommodating people from other ethnic or racial groups. So the problem of racial harassment and abuse is more extreme in these locations, and it is tabloid press and right-wing press and politicians who are fueling hate in these areas. So whenever individuals fear racist hate crime or hate crime victimization, they would visit the fieldwork organization or they would visit their GP. And I have interviewed GP on numerous occasions as well. They would make endless, so GP and the organizations would make endless requests to the Home Office or the housing providers to relocate these individuals to a safer area, okay? And in many cases, whenever they approach the Home Office or housing providers, they would ask for these requests of relocation to be accompanied with evidence, right? Such as the crime reference number or details of the attack. So it was very strange because the claim of being fearful or anticipating a racial attack, which in my opinion is a perfectly valid claim, was never sufficient, and only 1 out of 4 such requests were successful. So to be considered for relocation, what the authorities and housing providers were asking is that individuals prove they were genuine victims, in single inverted comma, genuine victims. So this didn't make any sense. And it also signaled a lack of prevention strategy and not proactively protecting vulnerable groups from hate incidents, right? And this is truly horrendous. There's also, you have to know, there's also a high existence or prevalence of pre-existing trauma. So as I mentioned earlier, that people are fleeing very difficult situations. They go through really difficult journeys. So they already have like a pre-existing trauma, and which is made worse due to the fear of victimization. So for instance, one of the doctors called Dr. McDonald, who was a GP, explained that when asylum seekers are placed in less tolerant part of the country, so besides the obvious physical and cultural characteristics and accents, etc., their mental distress and symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, which is which is hypervigilance, exaggerated behavior, strong feelings of suspicion, and behaving suspiciously around strangers, all of which are likely to attract further negative attention. And that puts them at risk of violence because they are behaving differently on top of their existing difference. So it is their vulnerability and their difference combined which makes them or puts them at risk of becoming victims of hate crime. So even in their daily lives, people would be controlled by their condition. So I will give you like a few examples. For instance, they would not visit this particular GP if there was a security guard outside, and this particular GP had a security guard outside their surgery simply because they were receiving threats. So this GP had used to take a very high numbers of migrants, and somehow that information got leaked out at one point. So they were receiving threats. So the GP chose to then have a security guard. But when people seeking asylum used to see security guard, they would just take a U-turn and not visit the surgery because they were absolutely scared of the security guard, right? Because it was reigniting the past trauma. There were incidences of flashbacks due to fire alarm tests, ambulance and police sirens. Individuals were scared of postmen knocking at their doors. So there was like a whole range of things that was something that I noted, something the participants, the practitioners mentioned to me. And it was these conditions were very strongly evidenced amongst those who were fleeing persecution and violence. The third aspect is around the reporting of hate incidents. A few cases that I noted in which individuals who were suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder had been threatened repeatedly with knives. They were physically assaulted. They had burning objects forced through their letterboxes. They experienced dogs being set on them as they walked outside their properties. And there was one case where a pregnant woman, whenever she opened her door or window, people started throwing stones at her. So entire day she would just sit in darkness and she would assess when to actually step out or see the light, right? In most cases, individuals either they did nothing or they informed the third-party reporting centers, but they chose to not go to the police. And I think that's a huge issue. So nearly all participants indicated a lack of trust in the police. They feared that if they filed a complaint, either that would have a knock-on impact on their cases, or it would result in them being reported to the Home Office, to the immigration authorities, and then being detained and deported. And I think what has made this even worse is the Tory government's hostile environment agenda. Okay, because they have engaged, the police have engaged in data sharing with the immigration authorities, and this data about victims. And this data sharing has increasingly deterred victims, especially with precarious immigration statuses, from coming forward to report crime. Huge issue, and I think police have to work harder to gain trust of these groups and protect these groups who are vulnerable and who don't trust them because of all these arrangements which are in place. The fourth point is around the denial of mental health support. So to start with, a sizable number of individuals, they were not able to register with the GP for a whole host of reasons. Okay, even if they did register with the GP, they could not communicate their conditions clearly due to lack of interpreter. Also, individuals can be redispersed to different locations without any notice or warning. So when individuals get redispersed, they find it difficult to fully explain their trauma and trust in your GP. And, you have to understand that, let's say if an asylum-seeking woman is subjected to sexualized form of torture or sexual violence, she will then have to repeatedly disclose what happened to her to different officials, and it can become really, really difficult. Okay, so sometimes they choose to not fully explain their trauma to the GPs. So in the absence of medical care or consistent medical care, there were certain individuals, and this was mainly young asylum-seeking men. They resorted to self-medicating to recover from distressing events and to numb the pain, right, of living in this country and being subjected to hostility. This resulted in them accessing, psychoactive medication from the underground market. And because these drugs were not prescribed by the doctor and they were coming from underground market, no one exactly knew what was the prescription strength because they were coming from unknown source. No one, it was of questionable nature. Further, because individuals themselves had no knowledge of the dosage or the damage the medication in itself could cause, but they had no choice over what was supplied to them, and which then, exacerbated their conditions. So I distinctly remember this man called Inam. It was a really difficult case, but I will explain to you what happened in the field. So he came up one day and he explained to me that there was one day he just had enough of his life. He was subjected to, electronic monitoring. He was, subjected to hate crime victimization. There was a lot going on with him and he just had enough. So he gave this drug dealer 20 or 30 pounds and he pleaded her to be injected with cocktail of really potent Class A drugs. The dealer initially said, no, this is too dangerous, etc. But then, he was administered with an overdose of, drugs. And he was in an abandoned estate, and he was lying there in semi-coma-like state for a few days, I think. And when he woke up, he was like weak and, and in a really difficult position. And when he mentioned that to me, it was just such a difficult story to comprehend with. And it just was like, it kind of just showed the sheer impact all these policies and practices are having on ground. So after living in precarious conditions for extended periods of time, there were certain individuals who were facing mental distress and psychological illnesses. They used that to submit a fresh claim to the Home Office, give fresh evidence to the Home Office. But because they were met with incredibly high medical thresholds, because system was constantly redefining what is it to be genuinely ill and what is genuine trauma. And for them, genuine trauma or being genuinely ill is something physical, something very evident. So they were actively discriminating between physical health and mental health. And Home Office would outright refuse to accept psychiatric reports, So in one case, for instance, a claimant was diagnosed with psychosis and had negative decision on his application. And in the reference letter, the Home Office case worker mentioned, "You are not suicidal." Almost that in the letter, it was implied that to be accepted as genuinely ill, the person should have or had to have committed or attempted to end his life and to provide evidence of it. I think it's truly appalling.
I think you're absolutely right to draw out the ways that the state is fueling hate through their attitudes and discriminatory policies. And the ways this is having a real and extreme impacts on asylum seekers whose basic rights to welfare and humanity are just not being met. I see that you used an ethnographic approach for this research, and you embedded yourself as a volunteer support worker with refugee charity organisations, over a period of 18 months. What challenges did you face in the field?
Oh wow, this would need another podcast, but I'm going to try and summarize this in few words. So the first challenge was trust. Okay, it was I found it so people would come and ask me whether I'm working for Home Office and whether I'm a secretive agent, that kind of stuff. And I had to constantly explain to them, no, that's not the case. I don't work for the Home Office. I'm a university researcher, etc. So after a couple of incidences of that sort, what I decided, I seeked approval from the organization, and we posted, they were like poster notes in different languages around the organization that said that there's a researcher who's part of the university. If you don't want to participate, just let us know and we'll let him know, that kind of thing. But it was very difficult to gain trust of people. Also, I had to be very careful about trauma exploration. So understanding pre-migratory conditions or why individuals flee violence, what happened throughout the journey, that was not something that I was looking to explore. And as a result of that, I chose to not ask those questions because, it was unnecessary and it would take individuals back to a point in time that they would rather not remember, or they're actively trying to get over it. They're trying to seek some sort of a stability, so it was important that, as a researcher, I understood that that's the terrain that I don't want to go into, and it's unnecessary and, counterproductive. The third was ethics. Yeah, never ever took consent for granted. So even if individuals consented to participate in the study, every meeting I would ask for consent again, that they were okay if we continue. And even if they showed a slightest of a sign of emotional distress, I would ask them whether they would like to stop, they would like to withdraw, because it was very important to me that they understood that they have control of the situation. Like, I'm not in control, right? So it's important to, and also for me, it was important to diffuse power positioning. And this is something that I understood quite earlier on. So they would also ask me questions about my life, right? And, in the first time around, I was like, oh my God, I'm not comfortable with this question. But then I went back and I was like, well, I'm asking them to tell me everything about what's happening to them, and, and they asked me, this person just asked me this one question: why did I feel that level of discomfort? So I had to speak to this person. So I chose to, whenever they asked me something, I would disclose it to them. So, they would ask me my marital status, they would ask me my migration status, they would ask me, where do my parents live? There was just a whole host. They would ask me about my sexuality, about my religion. I mean, the questions were not exhaustive, and I would give answer consistently and accurately, just because I felt that, that was a right thing to do. And, it helped me connect with individuals. Also, it was important for me to understand, not understand or keep an eye on the mood, but understand that, if things, if they are experiencing any form of distress, that I discontinue the interview.
And I guess it stays with you, doesn't it? Even if,
Yes.
you leave the field, it's something that you carry with you forever. But also, I guess that's a drive. And that's why we do this research, because we want to shed light on these experiences that remain hidden, but in some cases invisible and not even listened to. And this is why we need to keep trying. to raise awareness and make an impact, hopefully also in terms of policy and practice. And this podcast for us is a great resource, not just for our students, but hopefully for policymakers and practitioners who work in this field. I know we've covered a lot. Is there anything that we didn't ask you and you would like to mention before we bring the podcast to a close?
Sure, no, I think what you mentioned earlier, I just wanted to add one point to that we as researchers use ourselves as a tool in the data collection, process. So I think it's very important that researchers, when they feel overwhelmed and, when they think things are getting too much, I think they take a step back, they take a break. Self-care is incredibly important. I remember it took me a while to understand, what I was experiencing, collecting data, going through these stories, coming across individuals with so much trauma, and seeing, them being subjected to repeated trauma. And it was really difficult, very enraging. And I think when I took a step back, that's when I went for debriefing. And that's something that I acknowledge and also speak to my students, that it's important that we are self-reflexive, not just about power, positionality, but also, in a way, think about how the research is impacting us. And this is not navel gazing. This is important. Yeah, it's important to understand how the research affects us, but also our power position, etc. in the field. The only concluding point that I want to highlight is that there is a growing resistance from within the state bureaucracy, to this, to the infliction of harm. For instance, there's this group called Docs Not Cops, who are a group of NHS professionals, and they have consistently highlighted the harms of hostile environment within the medical settings.
Thank you for that. I think that's such an important point to end on, and it's almost a hopeful message as well, isn't it, that people are resisting. And like you said, it's the research, but it's the people on the ground and those who have the positions of power who are able to affect this change. So thank you. We really appreciate your time today to come and talk about this paper. And it's been an eye-opener, and it's a really important and current topic to be discussing.
Thanks for inviting me.
Thank you so much. And I also want to say thank you so much for all your hard work on this topic, your research. I've read your paper and other work, and it's something that actually it stays with you as a reader. And thank you so much for all your research and work in this field. Thank you so much.
Thank you.